New Zealand is one of the most geographically isolated countries on Earth, separated from the nearest mainland by thousands of nautical miles. However, this isolation has also made it one of the most unique because it possesses not only immense natural beauty, but also a rich and diverse culture that cannot be found anywhere else in the world. Even more remarkable is the fact that this human element of New Zealand's story developed relatively late, shaped by successive waves of migration from people all over the world within only a few centuries. So, how did this nation develop? Less than 1,000 years ago, from a collection of uninhabited islands into one of the most desirable travel destinations and places to live today. This is the history of New Zealand. We would like to let you know that some of the historical maps shown in our videos are now available in our online map store. Whether you are a history lover, a collector, or simply someone who loves the art of old maps, you will discover a curated selection of stunning prints. They are excellent as wall art, thoughtful gifts, or additions to your personal collection. Follow the link in the video description below to browse our collection and bring a piece of history into your home. New Zealand is the most recently settled major land mass on the planet, with the first people settling there only about 800 years ago, sometime between 1250 and 1300. These early settlers, like those throughout the South Pacific, were Polynesian and part of a larger movement during that period, known as the Great Polynesian Expansion, which involved significant maritime exploration and settlement across the Pacific Ocean. It is believed that this migration was carried out by skilled navigators known for their mastery of the stars and ocean currents. Using large ocean-going canoes known as waka, they crossed vast distances not only to settle in New Zealand, but also as far away as Hawaii, Easter Island, and possibly even South America. When these early settlers arrived in the land we now call New Zealand, or Aotearoa, they became the ancestors of the Maori people. They brought with them their knowledge of navigation, agriculture, and craftsmanship, as well as a complex social structure and a set of spiritual beliefs that would form the foundation of early Maori culture. The Maori quickly established themselves on the North and South Islands and created permanent settlements along the coasts and river systems. Maori society was based on a strong sense of kinship, with communities organized around tribes known as iwi, which were refined by bloodlines and shared ancestry. They also developed a sophisticated system of oral tradition known as whakapapa, which recorded their genealogical history, connected individuals with their ancestors, the land, and spiritual beliefs, and therefore formed the backbone of Maori culture. An important cultural practice that emerged during this period was the construction of fortified villages built on elevated ground for defensive purposes and known as pa. These settlements protected communities from potential conflicts with rival tribes and also served as social centers where communal activities, such as feasts and religious ceremonies, took place. Maori spiritual beliefs were deeply intertwined with daily life, and their worldview revolved around maintaining balance with the natural world. Their religion was polytheistic, with a pantheon of gods and deities who governed different aspects of life, from human creation to the changing seasons and natural resources. Within 200 years after the arrival of the first people in New Zealand, by around the 16th century, Maori society had developed a distinct cultural identity and had become increasingly complex. Social status was made visible through the practice of tattooing, and Maori chiefs, known as rangatira, possessed considerable power and influence. Their authority, however, rested on consensus and respect within the wider tribe. Leadership was dynamic, and a chief's ability to govern successfully depended not only on their ability to maintain social cohesion, but, even more importantly, on their military skill in times of war. Tribal warfare became increasingly common during this period as competition for land and resources intensified. Maori warriors, or toa, were highly skilled in close combat. Since their society at that time did not possess metalworking technology, their weapons were mainly made of wood, bone, and stone. As a result, the Maori often used psychological warfare to intimidate their opponents, especially through the performance of the haka, a ceremonial dance used before battle to demonstrate strength and unity of the tribe. Maori life in Aotearoa remained largely unchanged in the following decades until the arrival of the first Europeans in 1642. One problem that these European explorers did not have to deal with when they arrived in a new land. The Dutch explorer Abel Tasman sighted the northwestern coast of the South Island during his expedition to map the lands of the South Pacific. His two ships, the Heemskerk and the Zeehan, anchored in what is now Golden Bay, where they encountered a group of Maori for the first time. The meeting, however, quickly turned violent, resulting in the deaths of 4 members of Tasman's crew during a clash with Maori warriors who had come out in their waka canoes. Since Tasman interpreted the Maori as hostile, he left New Zealand without going ashore. Nevertheless, his brief visit later placed New Zealand on European maps, and in 1645 it was recorded in Latin as Nova Zealandia, named after the Dutch province of Zealand. More than 100 years would pass before European explorers returned to New Zealand. The British, under Captain James Cook, arrived in October 1769 aboard HMS Endeavour, followed only 2 months later by a French expedition led by Jean-François de Surville. As part of his voyage across the Pacific, Cook made several landings on both the North and South Islands and developed friendly relations with the local Maori. Although these occasionally ended in violent confrontations, he spent considerable time mapping New Zealand, which became crucial not only for his later voyages in 1772 and 1776, but also for other European explorers and traders in later years. Although Cook had claimed New Zealand in the name of Great Britain, initial efforts by the British government to send colonists to the area, as it had done in Australia, did not materialize. Instead, during the remaining years of the late 18th century, New Zealand was visited by British, French, and American whaling and trading ships. They traded goods such as iron, tools, and cloth in exchange for resources such as flax, timber, and food. Although there were some conflicts, such as the killing of the French explorer Marc-Joseph Marion Dufresne in 1772 and the massacre of the crew of the British ship Boyd in 1809, most contact between Maori and Europeans was peaceful. There was, however, one particular commodity that the Maori became increasingly eager to acquire from these passing traders: guns. The introduction of firearms into New Zealand had profound effects on Maori society and triggered a massive tribal arms race to gain territory or seek revenge for past defeats. In the so-called musket wars, Maori tribes fiercely competed for access to European firearms. The nearly 3,000 battles fought between 1806 and 1845 are said to have led to the deaths of 20,000 to 40,000 people and dramatically changed New Zealand's tribal composition. Within a few decades after the beginning of the 19th century, a handful of these passing sailors had founded New Zealand's first permanent European settlements around the Bay of Islands and Hokianga in Northland. Some, often runaway sailors or escaped Australian convicts, even settled among local Maori communities and became known as Pakeha Maori or European Maori. The early 19th century also saw the arrival of the first missionaries, who began converting the Maori to Christianity. Figures such as Samuel Marsden founded the first mission at Rangihua Bay in 1814, which not only spread the word of Christianity, but also introduced literacy among the Maori, whose language was then recorded in written form for the first time. Despite the growing number of British settlers arriving in New Zealand, the territory was not formally considered part of the British Empire. Some parcels of land had been individually purchased from the Maori by early settlers and missionaries. By the late 1830s, however, the increasing activity of the New Zealand Company, a private consortium of British investors eager to turn New Zealand into a fully functioning commercial colony, began to gain momentum. In 1839, the company announced plans to purchase large stretches of land, amounting to almost two-thirds of the entire country, often through questionable sales with the local Maori. The British government had previously acknowledged concerns expressed by the Maori regarding sovereignty, and, alarmed by the ambitions of the New Zealand Company, it temporarily incorporated New Zealand into the official territory of the British colony of New South Wales in Australia, while also sending Captain William Hobson as New Zealand's new lieutenant governor. The following year, on February 6, 1840, Hobson and about 40 Maori chiefs signed the Treaty of Waitangi, which formally established British sovereignty over New Zealand, while also granting and protecting the rights of the indigenous Maori people. The treaty subsequently became New Zealand's foundational constitutional document. However, because it was written in two separate versions, one in English and the other in Maori, disputes over its interpretation led in later years to challenges and confrontations over land. In 1841, New Zealand officially became a British Crown colony and was fully separated from New South Wales. As a result, it experienced a dramatic increase in the number of British settlers arriving on its shores. Driven by the opportunity to build a new life and own land, thousands of Europeans migrated to New Zealand in the 1840s and 1850s. They not only founded new settlements such as Auckland in 1840 and Christchurch in 1848, but also developed solar settlements such as Wellington, which had already been founded in 1839 and eventually became the capital of the country in 1865. Although the Maori had initially been open to the Europeans because of the trading opportunities they brought, it quickly became clear that the sheer number of settlers had been dramatically underestimated. Despite the recognition of Maori rights granted by the Treaty of Waitangi, land disputes quickly arose and began to escalate. The first conflict between the British and the Maori was the Flagstaff War of 1845 to 1846. Although it ended in a truce, it would not be the last outbreak of violence between the two groups. As the European population grew, pressure on the Maori to sell more land increased. Europeans had different concepts of land use for agriculture and settlement, and they saw the Maori reluctance to give up control as counterproductive to the progress of the colony. Violent clashes continued from 1845 onward, but escalated significantly in the 1860s. This series of hostilities, known as the New Zealand Wars, involved the deployment of around 18,000 British and allied Maori troops, who fought against a force of 5,000 Maori resistance fighters determined to defend their land at any cost. Eventually, by 1872, British and colonial forces had prevailed and confiscated around 6,000 square miles of Maori land. This left deep bitterness and resentment among the affected communities, something that is still felt today. As the number of British settlers continued to grow, the geographic distance from Great Britain was seen as an obstacle to the development of the colony. As a result, in 1852, it was decided to establish a central government in New Zealand, allowing the people there self-government with an elected parliament. In the 1850s and early 1860s, the country experienced a period of prosperity, with agriculture, especially sheep farming, becoming dominant. The discovery of gold in the Otago and West Coast regions also led to an increase in new migrants seeking their fortune, with the country's population rapidly doubling from around 80,000 in 1859 to 164,000 by 1863. It was not only immigrants, mainly from the British Isles, who arrived in New Zealand during this period, but also smaller numbers from the United States, India, China, and various parts of continental Europe. One of these migrants was Gottfried Lindauer from Bohemia, who arrived in New Zealand in 1874. As a trained artist, he quickly found work painting many prominent Maori chiefs and their families, accurately capturing their facial tattoos, clothing, ornaments, and weapons. His works, known as the Maori portraits, offer a fascinating insight into the traditional Maori way of life that might otherwise have been lost to history. Despite a brief economic downturn in the early 1870s, New Zealand continued its path of development under the leadership of Sir Julius Vogel, the 8th Premier of the country and the first Jewish person to hold that office. He initiated an extensive public works policy that included the construction of national infrastructure, including new railways and telegraph lines. Further political and social developments in the second half of the 19th century took place under the Liberal government of Premier Richard Seddon. This led to the creation of a comprehensive welfare state, with the introduction of old age pensions, labor regulations, and minimum wage laws. In 1893, voting rights were also extended to women, making New Zealand the first self-governing country in the world to introduce universal women's suffrage. At the beginning of the 20th century, New Zealand had developed into one of the wealthiest and most advanced colonial nations within the British Empire. However, discussions about whether the nation should gain greater political independence from Great Britain were already gaining momentum. In 1900, as the neighboring nation of Australia was going through the process of becoming a dominion of the empire, some political leaders played with the idea of uniting the two colonies. Many New Zealanders, however, opposed the idea, and the two nations ultimately remained separate, with Australia becoming a dominion in 1901 and New Zealand following in 1907. Dominion status allowed New Zealand to exercise a greater degree of domestic independence, while retaining constitutional ties to the British monarchy and government, which ultimately retained control over its foreign policy. This would have dramatic and formative consequences for New Zealand only 7 years later, with the outbreak of the First World War. Although the nation was relatively safe, because it was on the other side of the world from the main theater of war, New Zealand troops were sent into the region and occupied the territory of German Samoa in 1914. Around 100,000 of its soldiers were sent overseas as part of the Australians and New Zealand Army Corps, or ANZACs, and served with distinction in major campaigns at Gallipoli, in the Middle East, and on the Western Front. More than 18,000 died in the conflict. Their sacrifice, however, became iconic in New Zealand's memory and is often associated with securing the nation's psychological independence. The interwar years were a difficult period for New Zealand. It suffered not only from the effects of the Great Depression in the 1930s, but the first Labour government, elected in 1935, increasingly placed the nation's interests against those of the mother country, especially in international matters. These tensions, however, were quickly set aside when war broke out again in 1939. Although the threat to New Zealand during the Second World War was much greater because of the advance of the Japanese Empire across large parts of the Indo-Pacific region, most of New Zealand's military forces were devoted to fighting in Europe and North Africa. As in the previous conflict, the nation rallied and contributed enormously to the war effort, not only by providing more than 150,000 soldiers, but also by serving as an important lifeline for Britain by sending record shipments of food and materials. Although it had fought for the British cause during the conflict, New Zealand's relationship with the mother country changed irreversibly in the post-war years. Although it retained a predominantly British orientation, the dominance of the United States in the Pacific region forced New Zealand, together with Australia, to turn to America for security instead of relying on the distant British government in London. Closer relations with the United States eventually led New Zealand to send troops to the Vietnam War in the 1960s, which caused great controversy and protest. Military cooperation with the United States continued until 1986, when New Zealand was suspended from the Australia-New Zealand-United States Collective Security Treaty, or ANZUS, after declaring its commitment to a fully anti-nuclear policy. The second half of the 20th century saw New Zealand transform into the nation it is today. Immigration policy was liberalized, allowing an influx of immigrants from Asia into the country. At the same time, British immigration declined, and Australia became the largest contributor to the nation's migration flows in both directions. The Maori population also experienced a kind of renaissance during this period, as sought to reverse the decline of their culture and language that had continued since the early days of European settlement. This led to a change in attitude among many European New Zealanders, with the Maori language becoming an official state language in 1987, and many Maori themselves becoming active in political life in order to protect indigenous rights and ways of life. Today, New Zealand stands out as one of the most desirable destinations on the planet. Not only for those who visit as part of the country's thriving international tourism industry, but also for those who wish to build a new permanent home in the country. In many ways, this reflects the history of the nation. For a little more than 800 years, from the first Maori settlers to the latest arrivals at Auckland International Airport today, New Zealand has offered people who came to its shores from all over the world a lifestyle so desirable and unique that it simply cannot be found anywhere else.